Welcome back to Star Wars Elseworlds. I hope you've all been well. Disney's version of George Lucas's sequel trilogy concluded with Rey destroying the returning Emperor and bringing back balance to the Force, ridding the Sith for good. But what if things took a dark turn? What if Rey failed and Palpatine won in The Rise of Skywalker and killed not only her, but the last living Skywalker at the time, the redeemed Ben Solo? What would the consequences of this outcome look like? Would anyone be able to stop Palpatine moving forward? How would this affect the galaxy in the long term? While I don't like the sequel trilogy as a whole, there are still ideas in them that I can appreciate in isolation, such as this. For this what if story, we're going to delve into one of many possibilities that could result of this scenario. As with all what if stories, there is no definitive answer, as the story depends on the writer and the story they want to tell. For this what if fan fiction, I will mix in elements from the expanded universe, since there isn't any material to use within the Disney Star Wars timeline post Episode 9. So, let's enter an alternate universe of the Star Wars timeline, an Elseworlds, on what if Palpatine killed Rey and Ben on Exegol. Our story begins here in the final act of Episode 9. Rey had been struggling to hold off Palpatine's vicious streaks of lightning. As he told her that he was all the Sith, Rey got a hold of Anakin's lightsaber from behind, gripping it tightly in her hand, and motioned both lightsabers in an X shape, right as she shortly responded that she was all the Jedi. In the original timeline, Rey was able to overpower Palpatine by deflecting the lightning back onto him, which eventually disintegrated the Emperor into dust. But in this timeline, Palpatine's power was far too overwhelming for her. Rey pushed forward with pure grit and determination, but she noticed that she wasn't strong enough. While the blood of the Emperor flowed through her, she did not possess the discipline and training to wield such power. She struggled to move forward and could sense his power grow every second. This is where it began, the doubt, fear, and fever of powerlessness. Unlike Kylo, Darth Sidious was like no one she's ever faced. Rey started to step back, as she simply could not handle Palpatine's power. With each step that the young girl took, Palpatine's smirk grew larger, eventually forming a wicked smile. The Sith Lord cackled and laughed at Rey, telling her that a pathetic scavenger with no real training was no match for him. Rey panicked. Her face expressed fear like never before. She was undoubtedly terrified for her life. The lightning became too overwhelming for Rey. She lost control of Anakin and Leia's lightsabers. They fell out of her hands as she fell on her back from the impact. The lightning stopped. Palpatine lowered his hands with a sinister smile. Rey crawled away, attempting to reach for her lightsabers. Palpatine then monologued on how she will fall, as will the last Skywalker. His hands rose and he unleashed a devastating barrage of Force lightning. Rey screamed in agony as she felt her body burn from the inside. Her skin felt like it was being ripped off. The poor young girl had never felt pain and suffering like this in her whole life. She yelled, kicked, and violently shaked on the ground, her head bobbing back and forth violently as if her bones were being pulled by an invisible force. Rey's cries for help echoed throughout the Sith Citadel like a dying animal in pain. She begged and cried out for Ben's help, Luke and Leia's, but nothing came of it. She was in complete shock at how quickly things turned against her favor. She truly believed the Jedi and the Force was on her side. Maybe in another universe where she did defeat Palpatine, but she was sure that it wouldn't be this one. Rey continued to cry out in pain until she died. Her cries for help were met with nothing but continuous cackling sounds of lightning. The scavenger girl from Jakku had shortly died. Palpatine retreated his arms and laughed wickedly at the outcome. Looking down at the dead corpse of his granddaughter, Sidious laughed hysterically. Aboard the Millennium Falcon, Finn had been flooded with an overwhelming sense of sadness. He had felt Rey's passing through the Force. Rey's lifeless body laid motionless on the ground. Her eyes were open but devoid of a soul, an empty vessel. Palpatine stood over her. He glanced in the distance, seeing the hand of Ben Solo reach over the edge of the hole he had fallen into. Ben walked towards Rey's body, stumbling and struggling as a large portion of his life force had been drained by the Emperor. A part of Ben knew this was the end. He was weak and defenseless. The closer he approached Rey, the more that realization had settled. When Ben made it to Rey, he stumbled on the ground, grabbing and holding onto her tightly. He showed a look of desperation as he turned back to look at Palpatine, standing a few feet away from him, laughing. Ben looked back into Rey's lifeless eyes. He held her closer and tighter. This is the end. Everything in his life had brought him to this dark moment, this horrible outcome. He lost his mother, and now the young girl he loved, all in one day. Palpatine walked closer towards Ben, telling him that the Skywalker lineage ends here. The Jedi will be no more, and nothing in the galaxy would be capable to stop him now. Luke, Leia, and Rey were gone, and soon Ben Solo. There was no one left to stop the return of the Sith. Ben closed his eyes as tears streamed from his face. He had accepted the reality. Palpatine cackled. He rose his hands with a sinister smile again, letting out a destructive, blistering, and blinding light of Force lightning. He electrocuted Ben until his cries of pain were dead silent. Within just a few seconds, Ben Solo had been killed. Palpatine walked over the dead bodies of Rey and Ben. The sinister smile on his face only grew more as he let out the most wicked laugh. Soon after, the body of Ben Solo had disappeared, leaving nothing but his clothing. Palpatine returned to his seat. He looked up into the sky but didn't continue his lightning attack on the rebel fleet. He wanted them to believe they had won. The remaining rebel ships had successfully destroyed the Sith fleets by then. His goal was to have them all retreat to their main base so that he may wipe them all out in one single swoop. They wouldn't see it coming. Everyone retreated to a Jun Class. Palpatine ordered his remaining Sith cultists to track down the hyperspace coordinates of which the rebels had escaped to. He also had contingencies in place if the main fleets were to be destroyed. He commanded them to rise once the skies were cleared. On a Jun Class, the Resistance had been celebrating what they believed was a victory over the Sith Eternal. When Finn and Poe reunited, they embraced each other with a hug. Shortly after, Finn's joyful celebration with his friends turned into a clouded shroud. Poe noticed the concerned look he showed. He asked him what was wrong. Finn responded by saying that something didn't feel right. The ex-stormtrooper glanced up into the sky. A feeling of immense fear had taken over him. Out of nowhere, one of the Zyston ISD star destroyers from Exegol appeared in the sky. The booming sound of the ship arriving from hyperspace instantly caught the attention of all the Resistance fighters that had been celebrating on the ground. Realizing what this meant, they all panicked and rushed to their ships. Finn stood there stunned, knowing what was about to happen. The built-in Death Star weapon from the Star Destroyer fired one shot, and just like that, the whole Resistance base had been wiped out, with everyone in it. Finn, Poe, Chewie, Janna, Lando, Rose, Maz, R2, and C-3PO all met their quick end. Palpatine commanded his new fleet of Zyston ships with a built-in Death Star weapon to return to the planets of the original ones that had been destroyed, such as Jakku, Endor, Bespin, and many others. Emperor Palpatine had commanded his Sith fleet into the entire galaxy to finalize his new and eternal rule. A new era of the Sith Empire had begun for the galaxy, one with little to no opposition. Key worlds like Coruscant would be taken over and converted into the public capital world for the new Sith Empire, while Exegol remained as the secretive location for the source of his fleet and army. The Sith Eternal Order proceeded to conquer every planet in the galaxy, the first being the core worlds, such as Coruscant. The Dark Lord could now rule without a mask. He threatened every world with the might of the planet killers at his disposal. Any system that attempted to rebel would be blown away without hesitation. Having complete control of every corner in the galaxy within the following 20 to 30 years, Palpatine had achieved true power and control over every sentient species alive. Those he did not deem as worthy to exist in his galaxy were either wiped out or enslaved. This mostly comprised of alien species that were not human. Individuals that rejected his new Sith class system within every society would also be executed without remorse. This was called the Great Cleansing of the Sith Eternal by one Emperor Palpatine. As this cleansing occurred, the Sith Eternal saw the purging of many worlds in the known galaxy. Galactic society was reorganized into a new system, which ensured the complete and secure domination of the galaxy by the new Sith Empire. For the many decades that passed by, Darth Sidious ruled with no true enemies. He was one without equal. The most powerful being in the galaxy was him alone, as he saw the destruction of his past enemies that could have stopped him, such as Rey and Vader. Emperor Palpatine remained on the throne world of Exegol in the unknown regions, from which he governed his empire from the shadows. With no one to oppose him, Sidious spent most of his time continuing experiments in the dark side of the Force, as his goal was to ascend to a level of godhood that had not been seen since the days of the Mortis gods. Reshaping reality to his will was his biggest priority, as he almost achieved such a thing many decades ago when he almost accessed the world between worlds. To ensure a strong grip on the galaxy with no resistance, Emperor Palpatine grew his Sith army to immense numbers. There would still be Force-sensitive children being born. Palpatine would have them kidnapped by his agents and Sith cultists, so he may personally train them as Sith acolytes in the early years. The early era Sith acolytes eventually matured and grew in power to hunt down Force-sensitive babies for Palpatine's newly formed Sith Empire. They would be trained accordingly, but not powerful enough to overthrow him. In the decades that followed the expansion of his Sith Empire, no one ever dared to challenge his rule. It was rumored that Palpatine could easily wipe out hundreds of Sith warriors with one sweep of his Force lightning. This alone instilled a great fear and respect for the Emperor. Unlike the previous Sith orders of the past, Palpatine's Sith Eternal did not teach its acolytes and warriors to pursue personal gain, but instead to ensure and secure that the Sith Emperor would continue to hold onto his power. The structure of this empire would be like the ancient Sith Empire of the Old Republic, during the reign of the Sith Emperor Vitiate. The core of the Sith Empire's religion was the Sith Eternal cult. This cult had been weaved within every class system of Palpatine's empire, which preached the ultimate devotion and godhood of the Sith Emperor, and complete commitment to the dark side. The Sith Eternal enforced the exclusive worship of the Sith religion through their Inquisitors and Sith officers. All objects that had to do with other religions that weren't of the Sith were destroyed, and the culprits would be executed publicly to set an example. Sith shrines were built amongst Sith citizens, of which sacrifices were performed with the goal to gain Palpatine's favor. The majority of the Sith military had been made up of Sith troopers and a vast number of warships, populated with soldiers ranging from Sith warriors from many subranks and the Sith troopers themselves. One of the Emperor's first tasks that came to be was the legalization of slavery. Much like the empires before, slavery was the foundation on which this new Sith Eternal rule was built upon. Billions and trillions of sentient species were forced into slavery after Palpatine's great cleansing that occurred many years prior. This saw the complete extermination of non-human species. The slaves were made up of refugees from ruined worlds, criminals, Jedi sympathizers, as well as resistance ones. Many were randomly taken from their worlds and transported to Sith-controlled areas where bases and structures were being constructed. As the rule of the Sith Eternal grew, the galaxy would soon realize that all hope had been destroyed. No faction or group would be powerful enough to rival the Sith Empire and its godly Emperor. The main galaxy was not enough to satisfy Palpatine's thirst for conquest. It was then that rumors circulated throughout the galaxy that the Sith Empire would begin a new era of universal conquest, one that involved the search for neighboring galaxies, in which the billions that made up of the Sith Empire had been preparing to venture out into the unknown, within wild space, outside of the known galaxy. This venture would be called the Great Expansion, and happened around 80 to 100 years after the Emperor's victory on Exegol over Rey and Ben. However, this would have been met with challenges, as new foes would have risen from the shadows to challenge the Sith Empire's rule just 102 years later during the Great Expansion. These new threats towards Palpatine's rule consisted of an army of returning Yuuzhan Vong and a Sith Lord who considered himself the one true Sith that had been imprisoned and in hiding in the unknown regions just 25 years after the Battle of Yavin. This Sith Lord was Darth Krayt, who commanded the One Sith. Other foes would also creep from the shadows. One possible encounter that the Sith Emperor would be forced to confront would be that of the bringer of chaos herself, Abeloth. Sometime prior to these conflicts, however, Palpatine had come across a young girl who he had sensed through the Force. Eventually, he trained her as his new apprentice, so that she may then serve him and do his bidding during these great wars. This young girl would grow up to become the Sith Lord by the name of Darth Talon. I hope you guys enjoyed this short condensed story. This was more of a history lesson type story, much like the previous one with IG killing Grogu, but it was still fun to write. There wasn't much of a traditional story narrative to go on since all the main characters had been killed, so this was the best route to go with. Granted, I probably could have come up with a narrative that would involve Darth Krayt fighting Palpatine for the course of multiple years, and then the Vong Wars and Abeloth, but I really didn't want to do that. I just wanted this story to be a simple, fun little one-off, and then whatever happens afterwards or in between those 80 to 100 years or 50 years, however long it is, you guys could come up with that in your own mind. While I was researching information and coming up with ideas for this timeline, I found this old Reddit post that shared similar concepts that I had written down on my notes. I decided to borrow some elements to sprinkle them into this story. The link will be listed in the description. I mentioned prior in a community post that I will be writing a light side ending to the story in this already dark timeline, as it'll feature a very popular fan concept, being Jedi Finn.